Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. My name is Ashlen Hilliard, and my pronouns are she, her. I currently work as the Director of Events for the International Cultic Studies Association. If you have been watching this series or other webinars, you may have seen me around. So if you are watching today, I just want to extend my appreciation because that must mean that you must not be sick of me yet, but perhaps we'll see if that changes by the end of my talk today. Before I get into my topic of discussion, I also want to acknowledge the survivors in the audience listening. It takes so much courage to show up to a recovery event such as this one, especially if this is your first time seeking resources and not knowing what to expect. I realize that many of you are on your own unique road to recovery, and I don't want to minimize how difficult it can be to even just show up to a webinar series such as this one. So thank you again for being here. I feel very grateful to be closing out this SMGA recovery series. The facilitators have been a great team to work with, and I am very excited to continue this series by offering more webinars on second and multi-generational adult former cult members' recovery issues in 2022. So before I dived into my presentation, for those of you who may not know much about me, I kind of just wanted to give a little bit of an overview. I am originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, the Salt Lake City Valley specifically. My dad was in the Air Force and we moved often, but I lived in Utah from 4th grade onwards. So for me, that is what I consider to be home. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, and really enjoy living in the Pacific Northwest with my partner Ryan, my orange cat Ferguson, and my blind dog Hamilton. As far as experience goes in the field, prior to my work with ICSA, I was helping those leaving polygamous groups in Utah as a case manager at a nonprofit. I helped men, women, and children leaving a diversity of polygamous sects whose recovery needs range from minor, perhaps they just needed some more educational tools, to major needs, which involve coordinating with local law enforcement and ensuring their physical safety. Now that I live in Portland, Oregon, I work full-time with ICSA remotely, and I am one of the organizers of our local spiritual abuse forum for education meetups, also known as SAFE, for those seeking community who have left or who are considering leaving high control groups. I am currently in the master's program at the Psychology of Course of Control at the University of Salford, Manchester. I am in my final weeks of dissertation, and so I'm very excited to complete that program soon. And aside from professional and educational experience, I also have experience leading a high control group, which has generational involvement in my family. When I first started to get involved with this field, I often felt like I had imposter syndrome. Some reasons for this is due to the fact that I actually received an education. I went to college. I did not grow up in isolation or experience the influence of a cult leader in my life. I was extremely fortunate to have a family who loved me very much, who were just trying to do their best and raise me in the same faith tradition that they were brought up in. And yet, my experience involved spiritual abuse and the influence of controlling theology during my time in the church that I was born and raised in. And I think it just illustrates how diverse people's experiences are with coercive control in their lives, as well as the vast spectrum that these groups can lie on. Even though I may have experienced a different type of control, and that is one of a high control theology and spiritual abuse specifically, than what is typically discussed in this field, which there seems to be a lot of emphasis on cult leaders, for example. Survivors of abuse of any kind speak the same language and connect even if their experiences are vastly different. And there's certainly a lot that we don't know. More study needs to be done on the impact of generational involvement in groups, as well, of course, the ever-evolving needs of S and MGAs. But what I can confidently say about being an MGA, or an SGA for that matter, is that we often have a lot going on, like a lot going on. As you already know, the title of my talk today is It's Hard to Put into Words, Understanding My Experience with Spiritual Abuse. When I was thinking of a title for this series, I honestly realized that I had stared at my computer for 20 minutes trying to find a fitting title for this presentation. I kept thinking, I have no idea how to put this into words, where do I even start? And I'm sure that this is not too uncommon either. You know, sometimes we've realized that we've been negatively impacted, but we feel so overwhelmed at trying to understand exactly what unfolded that had left us feeling so distressed. During my time in the master's program in the psychology course of control, I learned about the power threat meaning framework developed by the British Psychological Association's Division of Clinical Psychology. I would like to share today how I have personally found this model helpful in quote unquote finding the words, as my title reflects. Just as a general note, I am not a mental health professional. I strongly advocate discussing with a professional what is best for you in your recovery. This model is not intended to be used in order to provide any kind of diagnostic criteria. It is a framework, one of several that can be used to help understand how control manifested in your life and how it impacted you. On their website, it is stated that the power threat meaning framework is a set of principles, not specific recommendations about how to proceed in particular circumstances. The intention is for people to try out translating these principles into practice in their own settings, where they are the experts, and for this to feed back into the further development of the power threat meaning framework. On this slide, and you'll notice that the image is a little strange, but I kind of like it at the same time. You notice two people are facing each other, and one, I kind of compare the one on the left was what I felt like my brain was after leaving this particular high control group. And through the use of learning about coercive control, learning about how control manifests in groups, about undue influence, I feel like my brain better reflects the one on the right. It is perhaps not as perfect as that particular squiggly line, but I feel like it's more organized, and I'm better to kind of break down how exactly power manifested. In the greater context, of course, of control, understanding someone's experience of engagement and disengagement with high control systems can be a valuable educational opportunity to identify ways in which psychological or other therapeutic approaches to recovery deserve critical reflection. I want to move forward today by using a case study to analyze course control through the use of the power threat meaning framework. And it just so happens that that case study is going to be of my story. I have found this framework particularly useful, learning more about my own experiences. And perhaps this may be of interest of you, and this could serve as an example if this is something that you would like to dive further into yourself. I thought that it would be best to really briefly, we'll just be scratching the surface, just kind of break down my experiences into three succinct topics. The first is a historical overview. The second is theological interpretations, and the third is the hermeneutical methodology of my previous group that I departed from. I was born and raised in the conservative, non-institutional Church of Christ. It's otherwise referred to as the hardline Churches of Christ by ex-members. It's also known as the Antis in some circles. I am considered to be a multi-generational adult, as I've mentioned before. This particular church goes back in my family several generations. It has become more and more apparent to me that those within this particular group aren't fully aware of their history. I was never taught the history of this movement and how that impacted scriptural interpretations over time. What I learned growing up was that this Church of Christ specifically was a restoration of primitive Christianity to recover in the modern age what was practiced in the first century. However, the actual origins of the church came out of the American Restoration movement, otherwise known as the Second Great Awakening. This vision of recovery and restoration was equated to purity in this exciting age of the new frontier and the glories and riches of a new land. It was colonialism. Because of these societal and cultural ideals, a number of religious movements came out of this period, one of the two largest of those being the Church of Christ and the Latter-day Saints movement, as documented in Reviving the Ancient Faith, the Story of the Churches of Christ in America by Richard T. Hughes. What I didn't learn about until much later in life was that the Church of Christ is defined as a sect that originated in the 19th century, partly from Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, who were considered the founders of the movement. It's also known as the Campbell-Stone movement. This sociological classification is not really discussed in the modern day church. The classification of the sect when defining the Church of Christ is awarded because it, quote, stands over against the dominant culture for the simple reason that it views itself as the exclusive domain of both truth and salvation, from which it maintains that other religious bodies and the culture at large have departed. End quote. That's on page 5 of Hughes's book. The Church of Christ abides by a noble conception of calling itself non-denominational because it argues that denomination were not an arrangement in the first century church and that they are therefore set apart from abstaining from sin for not pursuing a denominational model. Next, I wanted to briefly lay out some theological interpretations. The church that I was born and raised in makes the claim that they are the faithful remaining thread of the first century church, traced down through history to modern day. It is a product of Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone. Intentions were, quote, to reduce religion to a set of essentials upon which all reasonable persons might agree. And while this sounds like a good sort of vision, a vision of unity, vision of simplicity, the difficulty is that this led to the influence of the common sense hermeneutic. It meshed well with the ideals of the American frontier at the time. It was also combined with the rationalism of the Enlightenment. Namely, the reason was the epitome of this philosophical endeavor that scholars can systematically figure out the mysteries of the world. In other words, it's a common sense form of Christianity, born in mid-1800s America, that gave birth to the rise of a specific way of interpreting scriptures. The third aspect to my case study that I wanted to touch on is that of hermeneutical methodology employed by this particular high control system. And I know what you're thinking. You're wondering what on earth this word means, and I'll just break it down for you. Hermeneutical methodology is essentially what do they believe about the scripture and what is the basis for that belief and interpretation of that particular form of scripture. When we think of high control systems, especially in regards to perhaps those in Christian origin or Christian churches or even outside of religious systems, is the influence of a cult leader. That is something that I actually never experienced. But what's so fascinating about the way in which scripture was interpreted inside of this own church system was that a standardized methodology was applied to the scriptures. And it really descended from what I just talked about previously, this sort of common sense hermeneutic that came out of Thomas Campbell's Declaration and Address, which aimed to provide everyone with a set of rules to define truth in scripture. The difficulty, though, is that there is no other way to interpret or form your own critical thinking under this approach. The intent of the movement was to unify the church and create a simple evangelical Christianity free from all mixtures of human opinions and interventions of men, end quote. This particular group instituted its own methodology to interpret the scriptures known as CENI, C-E-N-I. Don't worry, I won't be going into that in depth with you. I just wanted to illustrate how sometimes these systems of control can present in theological interpretations. Okay, so we've reached the stage where I just really briefly went over my own case study. It was very brief. Like I said, we only kind of scratched the surface, but this section I'm really excited about. Next, we're going to actually apply the power threat meaning framework to my story. And I'm very excited to kind of share with you how I broke down this particular framework. And I think you'll understand as we start going through it how it's been really useful for me. As you know, my case study has many variables to consider. The power threat meaning framework as a course of control assessment tool has helped me understand my experiences. And as some of you already know, perhaps if there are mental health professionals in the audience, the approach of this framework consists of 4 main questions. So let's begin with the first question, which was, what has happened to you? How has power operated in your life? Power has been operating in my life in a multitude of ways when I was in that particular church setting. For example, and I just wanted to highlight a few of these specifically, there was power over my ideological views. There was power that came from authority figures, whether that was family members, whether that was leaders in the church. There was social power, the influence of my community around me, the values that they were upholding, and the implications, potentially socially, of not fitting in with that particular belief system. There was power over my bodily autonomy. For example, sex before marriage was forbidden. There was a heavy emphasis on purity culture. These are just a few examples of how power specifically was operating in my life during my time in the group. When we're also talking about power, when analyzing the dynamics of power, particularly in my case, it also made me think of Rod Dubrow-Marshall's totalistic identity theory. I broke down the different dynamics that were mentioned in play in my story and kind of created a funnel structure to demonstrate just how little power and choice I often found myself having because of the subjugation I felt from these different levels. I felt it demonstrates how many layers there are to unpack within my story. And it really helped for me to break down, even at a base level, starting with patriarchal systems, again, this feeling of subjugation. And of course, at the highest levels, I think for me at least, there was psychological pressure to be set apart or face spiritual consequences. In this case, would be hell, which was a very real fear for me. When analyzing the dynamics of power in my particular case, it really demonstrates how totalistic this particular group was in my life. Next question in the power threat meaning framework is, how did it affect you? What kind of threats did this pose? I connected these different threats with a circle in the middle, because many of these threats I feel overlap and intertwine with each other. These were the four main categories that I specifically sort of drew from analyzing my own narrative: physical, psychological, social, and educational. Physical, for example, there was an emphasis on purity, culture, and modesty. Any sort of relationship outside of a heterosexual relationship was considered sinful. I was not allowed to pursue my true sexual identity. Psychological pressure, of course, to adhere to a belief system, and the result of that left me with mental health issues related to feeling this lack of autonomy. It specifically for me manifested in the form of anxiety. And the final two questions of the power threat meaning framework, I just put them on the same page here, is what sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these situations and experiences to you? Of course, in my experience, I was feeling anxiety, as I mentioned, from a lack of feeling autonomy over my own situation. I often felt powerless due to hierarchical structures, but also due to the overwhelming fact that involvement was cyclical and multi-generational for many of my family members. Just kind of that feeling of this is your course, feeling stuck. I also felt voiceless. A lot of this was due to women's roles within the group. Women weren't allowed to be in any sort of leadership position in the church. And of course, being in a very patriarchal system, the way women were treated were differently than the way that men were treated. And to question number 4, what did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat responses are you using? In order to survive, I complied. I trusted. I remember even just mentioning that word, the first thing that comes to my head is a hymn called Trust and Obey, where there's no other way. And in the middle, I wanted to put survival, because as referenced with the totalistic identity model, I did and we all do what we have to survive. And at the time, we may not realize what other choices are available to us or out there. I really like this quote by Reverend Bob Pardon, who spoke about this in an interview on spiritual abuse. What ends up happening is an individual who falls into one of these groups is they begin to confuse their commitment to Christ to the commitment to the group. This becomes synonymous. To leave the group is to leave God. In that instance, the group begins to exercise a tremendous amount of authority and control over their lives. How they operate, what to do, how to think, what's right, and what's wrong. I thought that this quote beautifully summed up my experience and how I was treated when I departed from this particular church. Sure, I left a faith tradition that was heavily involved in my family, and in anyone's families, if a child departs from a particular faith tradition, that can certainly rock somebody's world. But beyond that, it wasn't just that I was embarking on a new discovery, so to speak. I was literally viewed that I was leaving God entirely. To leave the Church of Christ was to leave God in the minds of those who adhered to this particular faith. And you can only imagine the difficulties in recovering from a system such as this. So finally, I want to discuss, understand your experience. I wanted to include a template for you all today. Equally, we all have a right to describe our experiences in the way that makes sense to us. In the longer term, this framework is intended to support the construction of non-diagnostic, non-blaming, demystifying stories about strength and survival, which reintegrate many behaviors and reactions currently diagnosed as symptoms of mental disorder back into the range of human experience. I really like this quote by Dr. Lucy Johnstone, who was one of the founders of this particular framework. We've talked about in past Q&A sessions during this SMGA recovery series how difficult it can be in a therapy session if we feel like we have to go into and over-explain the group that we were a part of. There have been instances where people have told me that the therapist was so caught up in the particular group they left that the client's needs weren't being met. Again, it's all about demystifying our stories and understanding that everything we've went through has truly had an impact in some way in our recovery process. Using the power threat meaning framework focused on my strengths. I think that what I used to view as a weakness, because for much of my life I complied and obeyed in order to survive spiritually from going to hell. What needs to be emphasized is that I have so much strength and resilience to survive what I did. You have so much strength and resilience to survive what you did. A psychoeducational approach has helped equip me with information and understanding about my own experiences to make a lifetime of choices and help empower myself moving forward. Applying frameworks such as the Power Threat Meaning framework has helped me better understand my experiences. Julie Jenkinson is a therapist who utilizes a psychoeducational approach in therapy with former members. And she said this: "It is my belief that with or without therapy, former cult members are at risk of remaining in psychological or relational limbo for years. If they come to understand how cults operate to control their members' thinking and behavior, and they have an opportunity to tell their personal story within a relational psychoeducational therapy that can offer them tools to understand their experience, manage their emotions, and process their trauma and loss, there is real hope for recovery of the autonomous self and growth. I feel more confident that I can now put my story into words." Thank you so much for your time today, and I will now be happy to answer any questions.